I'm Paul Moffat.
I'm Jan Moffat.
And this is Clockworks, a Legion podcast. If you've been listening to Clockworks, you know that we've been very struck by the music throughout Legion. We've talked about the song choices at the end of every episode, but we haven't talked much about the score. We'd been planning to talk about the score throughout the series at the end, and we're very delighted to have with us someone who can offer a unique insight and perspective on the score. Jeff Russo wrote the original music for Legion, and we are absolutely delighted to have you here with us. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me in cyberspace.
So first, my first question is, generally, do you watch a TV show that you're involved in making? And specifically Legion, but in general, having made the show, do you then watch it?
So the answer to that question is resounding yes. And it's interesting because I have an interesting perspective and perception, speaking of Legion, but I have a very interesting perspective on it because when I get episodes to write to, none of the VFX are done. So I don't really get to see finished versions, not even at the mix. When we go to mix, like usually the VFX aren't even done. So I watch on the air for a number of reasons, not the least of which is I've never seen what it actually ends up looking like.
I'm sure
on the air, yeah.
I'm sure.
And aside from all that, I love the show. I actually really, really, really love the show. So it's a treat for me to sit and watch. And then, of course, if I'm watching with my wife or I'm watching with friends or whatever, they're all like, "Wait a second. Is David crazy?" Or just like, "Do you really want me to tell you the answer to this question? Because if I can give it all away if you'd like." And they're like, "Oh, no, don't."
How does it work writing the music for a series? And by that I mean, at what point are you coming in? Are you,
Okay, so the phone call that I ran out here on was Noah Hawley, and he's the filmmaker, he's the creator, Svengali, this, so I think I might be one of the people he interacts with earliest. We start talking about what the music is going to be and what he's thinking of tonally, and then I start writing music right away, like based on a conversation. Based on, for Legion, we had our first conversations in the summer of 2015. And, he might have sent me the first script, sometime in the fall, but I had started writing music right away. And because it was music that I knew I was going to love writing, because I grew up listening to Pink Floyd. I grew up listening to Penderecki, all kinds of weird stuff that I knew I was going to do. Because we talked about Pink Floyd sort of being a sound touchstone for the show in terms of how I go about writing the material. And we also sort of talked about how we thought Dark Side of the Moon was sort of like the 70s schizophrenic manifesto. It was the Schizophrenics manifesto, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So why not take what that was and see how I could, use that in a tonal way, in the show. So the very first thing I did was go and buy an EMS Synthy, which was the synth, one of the main synthesizers that Dave Gilmour used on that album, and I plugged it in, and I remember starting to program it, and it did this thing, and I was like, "Oh yeah, that's the sound, that's the thing." So he's sort of trying to weave that into the score was a really interesting thing for me. When it comes to the music for this particular show, I'm so excited. I get so excited.
And on the topic of Pink Floyd, definitely. Specifically, On the Run seems like a musical touchstone that comes up throughout your score.
It's interesting. So On the Run, I didn't just rip off Pink Floyd.
No.
And I say that I say that with all love and respect for that band because they are my favorite band ever. And I grew up loving Pink Floyd. So that's to say, when Noah first sat down and we talked about it, and he was like, what do you think of, what are your thoughts on Dark Side of the Moon? I was like, you're kidding, right? Like, Pink Floyd's my favorite band of all time. Dave Gilmour's the reason why I started playing guitar. So On the Run consists of this ostinato played by a synthesizer, and then it gets faster and slower. So with that, I sort of used that idea and applied it to some melodic ideas that I had for David, and which was this repeating synth line that then gets also played by an orchestra, and then also gets played by a flute, and also gets played by all different kinds of things. So the idea of that repeating ostinato comes back the whole season, yes. And in that, On the Run was the sort of genesis of that idea. Right. It's that sound, it's that synth, and
the looping that comes up in David, and it comes up in 127 Hours, and it comes up in Seeing Things, Hearing Things too. The loop
it comes up everywhere.
It comes up everywhere, faster and slower and louder and changing, as you said, the instrumentation. That's, for me, listening to the score, that was the most, the easiest touchstone with Dark Side of the Moon for me to recognize.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's the big, that and the fact that there are these sort of very weird sounds that you would just, are not necessarily musical, that are just sort of sound effects. And they used a lot of that stuff on those records as well. So with that, like that coupled with this more sort of warm orchestra feel, it was sort of like that was the original sort of idea that I could infuse all of this into a score.
Right. On the topic of the kind of process of how it works to write the music for a series like this, how closely do you work with the music supervisor, Maggie Phillips?
Okay, so Maggie and I have become really, really close friends over the last 2.5 years since she got brought on to Fargo season 2. I would say that there are moments where we work really closely, and then moments where we are doing our own thing very separately. Like when I'm sitting and writing, I will send her pieces of music to get her feedback or input. Like, what do you think of this for this? What do you think of this for that? And her taste in music is impeccable. So when she says, well, I don't know, does that really work? I take it very seriously. And occasionally we have to work together in terms of, I either have to figure out how to make score work going into or coming out of a song,
right,
or vice versa. There's this piece of music that I've written that Noah really wants to use here, but we want a song to go right after it. We sort of have to figure out, well, what song will really work.
Right.
In that way, we're definitely having a conversation back and forth about what the music is doing. And then, there's also talks of music budgets and all that kind of boring stuff that we really want to talk about.
As you're working on a show like Legion or like anything, how important is it to you that you understand and convey characters and plots or the specifics of the specific scene that you're scoring? And especially, like, as you said, you start working on it very, very early. So how important is it that the specific scene is conveyed in the music?
I think it really depends on the scene. I start writing from a character perspective. I think about characters and what they hear in their heads and what they might sound like, or how I might represent them musically. And it isn't until there's a really full-fledged storyline going on that it becomes more important in how and where to use music.
Right.
The idea of writing thematic material that I then come back to for, a lot in a series is a very cinematic approach. I take that approach with the music that I write for any show, or I'd like to think that I do. And it helps tell a story over a long period of time. So I don't look at series like 10 individual episodes. I look at it like one 10-hour-long movie, or in Legion's season 1, an 8-hour-long movie. And I think it's really important to flesh out what the sound of a show is and what the sound of each character is. It doesn't necessarily have to be like the flute represents Sid and the synth represents. It doesn't have to be so specific. although it can be that specific, I feel like in general, having a very broad approach to music for a project is really, really important, because that helps keep the whole story cohesive.
Speaking of the specific instrumentation for a specific character, though, can you talk at all about the horn motif for The Devil with the Yellow Eyes?
It's funny. I ended up recording and writing a bunch of orchestral effects for very dramatic use and purposes. So, and with that, I hand it over to my music editor, who will then put it in places and like, well, what do you think of it here? What do you think of it here? What do you think of it here? And then when we saw it with the Devil with the Yellow Eyes, who ends up being obviously the Shadow King, spoiler alert, all of us were like, oh, that's it. Like, that's the thing. That's the sound, like that weird sort of horn blast. And once I figured that out, then I went back and recorded like 20 different versions of that. So whenever I saw him, I could figure out which one would work best.
It's a very disconcerting sound, for sure.
Very disconcerting character.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really, the thing, a lot of the score was meant to keep the audience off balance.
Yeah.
The idea was, if our main character doesn't know the difference between what's real and what is real, why not invite the viewer to also be in the same predicament?
Mm-hmm.
If I don't know what's real, why wouldn't it be okay for whoever's watching also to not know the difference between what's real and what's hallucination?
Absolutely. And that's the thing. I've read some other interviews with you where you talked about the music transitioning from real to imaginary. Can you talk a bit about what you mean by that?
Well, what I meant was transitioning from the organic to the inorganic, or what you feel is real to what you don't know if it's real or not. And really the synthetic part of the score, the synthesized part of the score, really did more represent the unreal world, even though what we come to know is the things that weren't real were actually not real anyway. They were all imagined in his brain, right? So there was never a time where reality wasn't reality.
Right.
If it makes any sense. So I had to try to figure out like how to manage these themes to feel like, so you're real in his head or you're not real in his head, but if you're outside, then can I misdirect or can I not should I not be misdirecting? But a lot of that was synthesized. The synthesized version of it was sort of like David's hallucinations, and the more organic stuff was the more real stuff, and normally that had more to do with Sid and his relationship with Sid.
Right. So your the physical instruments are representing, whether they're representing what's real in the show, they're representing what for you is musically real. Is that?
Well, I mean, it was really just about, that was a narrative device, really, and it was meant to sort of just be the thing that signified one or the other. The idea for me also was never to have it be the same way twice.
Right.
So as to not let the viewer know, well, okay, I'm hearing that piece of music, this must be.
Yeah.
The idea was you're never supposed to know. So I never played the same thing in the same way more than once.
Right.
It got very confusing for me, I think.
I believe it.
So the repeated motif of the looped run of notes, right? We talked a bit ago about how it's reminiscent of Pink Floyd, but the other thing about it is it's very mechanical. And I think specifically of Chaos and Madness and 127 Hours, which both end with the music box, especially 127 Hours ends with the music box running out of juice or whatever. Can you talk about the mechanical element of the music?
Well, it's funny. It's like at Noah's request, I read an Oliver Sacks book called Hallucinations. And, one of the things he talks about, like, what a hallucination might sound like, or what kinds of things happen to sound in the brain, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that was just sort of my take on that. Like, a music box that sounds beautiful and sounds lovely and then gets warped and falls apart.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it felt like that was how David felt. So the music box really signified David's memory of himself as a child, which at moments, and there's a track called Young David, which starts out with this very lovely, beautiful sound. But if you extrapolate, now I'm getting really crazy, like maybe even too nitpicky a party.
We're nitpicky.
If you extrapolate Young David to Chaos and Madness, or Young David to 74 hours, what you realize is they share a harmonic structure, and there's that beauty part of Young David, which is him and his memory of his mother. And then as you get into Chaos and Madness, which is sort of the other side of that coin, you hear those same melodies deconstructed. And then not only do they deconstruct, but then they start to warp. And as they start to warp, that's his whole thing changing. So it wasn't really about a mechanical versus a non-mechanical. It was about, how do I get to that sound?
Right.
And that seemed the path of least resistance. Like, what's a mechanical thing that makes music, and how can I warp that and break it down? So it's like basically putting your finger on a record player and slowing it down. And then imagine if you were to push down really hard, and then the record would break, and then you'd hear the cracking of the record breaking. It's sort of that idea. But the idea wasn't necessarily the mechanics of it. The idea was, how do I get that sound? And a mechanical thing, in this case the music box, was the easiest way.
Right. Makes sense.
So you talked, just a second ago, you talked about Oliver Sacks' hallucinations. I actually read the auditory hallucinations.
For a hat, or
no, I read the auditory hallucinations chapter of that book. And
there you go.
Sacks talks about. I mean, there's a couple of things that really stuck out to me. One of them is Sacks talks about a patient with tinnitus who she describes as sounding like cicadas in her ears. And when I read that, I immediately thought of the crickets, the choir crickets.
That's funny that you say that, and I remember when I went to write that piece of music, thinking, first of all, the thing I needed to do was figure out what was the sound in her headphones, because it was that was supposed to put her to sleep, and there was the sound of crickets in the production audio, because they were recording somewhere where there were crickets.
Right.
So I ended up sampling the crickets and then putting the crickets. So like it sounds like crickets. It sounds like crickets. And if you really pay attention, all of a sudden the crickets become in tempo.
Right.
And as the crickets play in tempo, that's when the sort of piece begins and the choir starts to sing. And it was just one of those things where I remembered hearing cricket, and the same thing has happened to me. I remember falling asleep and hearing crickets, and then hearing the crickets slowly become in time, and then falling asleep, and then all of a sudden I woke up and it was over. And that was the thing that sort of led me to the putting the crickets in time and then having the sounds of the voices over it. And I thought it was the quickest way to get her to fall asleep.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, that I have to say, the score throughout is evocative and compelling and psychedelic and all kinds of good things, but that particular track is just beautiful.
Yeah,
it was very, very beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Still on Oliver Sacks' hallucinations, though, the other thing that he talks about in that chapter is a tendency for hallucinations, for the auditory hallucination to suddenly stop or suddenly change. This is another thing I really noticed throughout the score. There's a lot of times that the song will suddenly end rather than coming to kind of a what feels like the expected ending.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to do that as a dramatic effect, more the stop than the dramatic shift. The dramatic shift, definitely has its roots in what you're talking about. But those sudden stops are usually for narrative reasons, and they can be very effective. I tend to do that not just in Legion. I've done that in Fargo before as well. And, I somehow end up talking about both those shows in the same sentence, because they have absolutely nothing to do with each other from a style perspective, or from any, but from a process perspective, they're very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So I can approach things from the same way. That's why I end up talking about both those shows in the same sentence.
The example of a song suddenly ending in a dramatic sense, the most obvious example that comes to mind in Legion is the what you've called the Bolero, your arrangement of Bolero that suddenly ends and really has that dramatic effect. Which brings me to the question about that song, that you called it Bolero. What did you change from Ravel, and why was it important to change?
Okay, so this is what happened, and this was all a happy accident. I was having a conversation with Noah, and he said we were trying to figure out what episode 7. There's this whole sequence in episode 7. When Oliver starts to conduct, and that whole sequence. And originally, he had wanted to just use Bolero. Let's use Bolero. It's very effective and it's a beautiful piece of music. And we're like, this is great. Yeah. And because it was in this sort of dream state, he wanted to go back and forth between score and Bolero, right? So there would be some sort of score and some sort of Bolero, and I had said, well, why wouldn't we just do like altered version of Bolero, like an electronic altered version of Bolero, so you play Bolero when you're in the one hand, and then when you see the Shadow King, you switch to score. You switch to the electronic version of it, and then you switch back, and then you switch back, and that was the original idea. So what did I change? There wasn't really much to change. There's da 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 da. That you don't change that. So there's a harmonic change where I changed it from being a major harmonic to a minor harmonic, which instantly makes it sound a little off and darker. But what I didn't know they were going to do, and I think that this literally happened by accident, is they played the LSO's version and my version at the same time. And they both happened to line up from a tempo perspective, because the fact is I didn't take anything from that recording. I just was like, okay, so here's the tempo, let's do this and just put it together. The fact that they played together was accidental. And then it just happened, and I called our version Bolero, and obviously that's Bolero. So when we put it together, I just figured we'd call it Bolero. And, but all that was sort of happily accidental.
We talked to Denny Gordon a while ago, who directed that episode 7, and she said that the silent film element of that section was only decided after it had all been filmed. So the music ends up being even more crucial to that scene.
I think that's where the accident happened. Like once they started editing it, and then Noah called me, he was like, okay, so it's a silent film now, so it's all going to be music. There's no dialogue, there's no air, there's no nothing. And I was like, great. So then he said, but I want you to come down and screen this. And they did, and they played it at the same time. And it was just like, oh, this is brilliant. This works in a way that it was never meant to work. And yet we meant to do that.
Yeah.
It was very effective, certainly. You talked a couple of times about harmonic changes, and that reminds me of something that I've also noticed, but I've also heard you say in other interviews about the use of atonality in this series specifically. Can you talk a bit about the use of atonality in Legion?
Well, yeah, I put I put together a string quartet and did a bunch of music with a string quartet that was atonal. And part of that was, my version of trying to do crazy music.
Right.
Like I start, what I would try to do is I'd write one line and then I'd write another line in reverse, and then I'd write another line in reverse of that, and I just sort of put them all together to see how that would work. And then sometimes it worked really well, and sometimes it didn't, and those people would never hear. But the ones that it worked out really nicely on were these ones like when he first walks into Clockworks, and you hear this sort of like, that was my idea of what does it sound like musically to walk into a fake asylum, an asylum that you don't know whether or not it's real or not, because at the beginning you think it's real, but is it?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things throughout the show that we've noticed is that the setting is very disorienting in time, in space. I mean, how does the music contribute to the disorienting setting?
I think that was part of the idea as well. It's like, one of the things that I wanted to try to do was keep the listener and viewer off balance.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Never have an expectation.
What are your feelings about listening to a soundtrack of Legion or any soundtrack independent of the show? I mean, the soundtrack, you can buy it on iTunes, and we'll have a link to it on the show notes. But is it an independent, standalone piece of art, or is the whole thing, music, visuals, narrative, all a piece together?
It's both. It's both. The thing I said, I don't remember where I said this. I said this to an old friend. I sent him the album. I remember I sent the album to somebody who I was in a band with in high school.
Right.
And I said, take a listen to this. I think I've finally been allowed to make the album that I've always wanted to make, which is, this sort of trippy psychedelic thing. I wrote a lot of the pieces as standalone pieces of music for this story. So part of it is like, imagine a rock opera with no vocals, right? The vocals for the rock opera is the dialogue of the show. So I really do think that the music in the album is listenable from top to bottom, and it really tells a story. And I tried to form the volume 1 of the soundtrack that way. We're going to release a volume 2 that is, well, first we're going to release a special edition vinyl 4-disc set, which is I've taken 2 pieces of music off, and I'm putting 2 other pieces of music on the vinyl album, one of which is Falero, because it didn't end up on volume 1 because we didn't want to give it away.
Right.
Meaning, like, we wanted the first time you heard that to be when you watched episode 7. There's also another piece of music, which is the opening of episode 8, which is this big harpsichord piece of music that I wrote. I also didn't put that on the soundtrack as well because I didn't want to give away the opening of the finale episode, So we're doing a volume 2 that will a volume 2 CD and digital release that will have Falero and the harpsichord piece and some other pieces. But the vinyl record will have both of those as well.
Right. Well,
to me, it's definitely like smoke some weed and listen to the record like you would have Dark Side of the Moon or whatever, have a glass of wine. but do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of a part. It's a part of the. It's an experience. Watching the whole or listening to the whole thing might be sort of like an oral experience. You might want to put some headphones on and do it.
Is Legion, you said a second ago that it was your chance to write the album you've always wanted. Is Legion unique in that, or is that the way you approach soundtracks in general?
I think that, again, it all depends on the program material. In the case of Legion, I approached it like I was writing music and trying to tell a story with music. That way I was reading scripts because I wasn't really seeing picture until we were about halfway done shooting.
Right.
So I wrote a lot of the material while reading the first 5 scripts. not knowing what episodes I had never known what episodes 7 and 8 were. I have an idea as to what all three, the first 3 seasons will be. There is a story arc that I'm aware of,
right,
and that has informed what I'm writing in the music and what will inform what I start to write for season 2. But it is sort of created as music, and that's sort of the interesting part of writing for this particular show, because I got to sort of figure out what the character sounded like and then apply it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm looking at the time. I'd love to talk to you as long as you would talk to us, but I think that we should let you go. I want to just, before we wrap up, where can people look forward to hearing from you next? Where should people look next to hear your work?
Well, so Fargo season 3 is on the air right now, and I'm working on it continuously. And then I will start Legion season 2 sometime over the summer. And I am doing a couple of other things. I'm just finishing up a movie right now called Lizzie, which is the Lizzie Borden story, starring Chloe Sevigny and Kristen Stewart. So there's that. A couple of other things that I can't really talk about.
Yeah,
really, because they say don't talk about it until it becomes a reality.
Yeah,
right.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It has been delightful to talk to you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you guys again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. And that was our interview with Jeff Russo. What did you think of that?
He was a really nice guy. It was really fun to have an interview with him. I didn't speak very much because I was super nervous. And in our original plan, we had some scheduling issues. And so originally it was only going to be Paul talking to him. And then I was able to be there for the actual interview. But I didn't have any of the questions in front of me. And so I just kind of sat there and and was like super overwhelmed. But that was awesome.
And I was also listening through again to edit. I was obviously nervous. And we both laugh a little bit too hard. And he'll say something a little funny. And we're both like, please let us. But yeah, it was a great interview. He's
really insightful.
Yeah, so interesting to talk to. And we really appreciate him giving us the time. He's obviously a very busy guy. In fact, we had the interview scheduled. We connected on Skype, and as the Skype picked up, his phone rang, and he went away, and it was Noah Hawley on the phone, the showrunner of Legion, that he went away and talked to for however long he talked to, and then came back, and it was obviously a busy guy. We really appreciate him spending some time with us.
Absolutely,
it was fantastic. He's obviously also a quick mind, thinking about a lot of different things. And one of the things in the interview is he kept answering questions that I hadn't asked yet. I'd ask one question, and in his answer, he'd answer, the 2 or 3 other questions I had down to ask. I was made me jumping all around my list, so I wasn't following any order, but it also is obviously he's thought about all this stuff and how it all connects to each other and what it all means to him. And I hadn't really thought
about how deeply a score person would be involved that early on in the show. I assumed that he would kind of come in after it was made and score over top of things, but of course no, he's there right from the start. So that's really cool. That's new information for me.
It's a question we didn't ask, but I'd be curious to know how typical that is. Because he said Noah, he's one of the earliest people he thinks that Noah talks to, and I wonder, is that Noah Hawley is a musician as well as being a writer, as well as being a film writer and novelist. He's a but anyway, I wonder whether that's usual for all shows or whether that's a Noah Hawley idiosyncrasy to have him involved so early.
The only thing I'm really aware of is I've watched a lot about. I'm a huge Buffy nerd, and so I've watched some behind the scenes thing on Buffy and with Christoph Beck, who of course is amazing and has gone on to amazing things. It felt like he was kind of watching the show and scoring over top, and so that's kind of what I thought it was. But maybe I was just wrong in my interpretation. I don't really know much. And I feel like it takes a long time to score music because I'm not a musician at all. And so I feel like it would take a long time to come up with like original music all the time. But if it's your job, I guess that isn't, you know.
Well, I mean, it takes time to create
it does
something
take time.
new and to perfect it.
Yeah.
Right? And clearly, Jeff Russo is I don't know if he's clearly a perfectionist, but clearly he's putting a lot of thought into every detail of the music.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, which I love. And you can see it. You can tell when you watch the show that Legion is well done. And we've been watching Fargo lately because so many Legion people are involved in Fargo, and he does the score for that, and it's very different but also very compelling and very good. And suddenly I'm listening for it or watching and going, oh, that's Jeff Russo, he wrote that song and it's really good.
Yeah, and it's like we hadn't watched Fargo, and even if we had, this was an interview about Legion, but it's so interesting that he also wrote the music for Fargo, which is so different. Mm-hmm. And yet I think there's aspects that once you know it's the same person writing it, you can see it.
Yeah, you can kind of see it. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, one of the things that came out of this interview is I need to make a correction to our music I talked about in episode 8. I misidentified something at the beginning of episode 8 as being a Bach piece, but it is not. It was original. The harpsichord piece at the beginning of episode 8 is written by Jeff Russo. Mm-hmm. I mean,
it's a fairly high compliment to think that it's Bach, you know? I
mean, in my defense, it's a small defense, but I looked up the songs in episode 8 and it was listed as being what it wasn't.
Yeah.
But I was caught trying to pretend I knew more than I did because I looked up the Cagliera, but I hadn't been familiar with that piece at all, but I kind of talked in episode 8 as if I was. Mm-hmm. Obviously I wasn't, because it wasn't that at all.
Yep.
It was an original piece written by Jeff Russo.
I'll be more careful in the future.
Will be indeed. Anyway, any other thoughts to...
I don't think so. I think that's pretty much it. Great interview, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to more interviews in the future.
Absolutely. If you want to contact us about this interview or about our show in general, you can find us on Twitter at ClockworksCast. You can email us at clockworkscast@gmail.com. If you like our show, we'd really appreciate a rating and review on iTunes. It helps people find it. And even more, if you'd like to support us, you can support us on patreon.com/clockworkscast.
You can find us on the web at goodstuff.fm/clockworks.
I've been Paul Moffat.
I've been Jan Moffat.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.